Karen Thompson was a devoted mother of 3.
She always tried her best to do special things for each of us.
Her husband, Paul, was just as devoted.
He was very good with the children, and the children liked Paul.
And by the fall of 2001, they'd been together almost 8 years.
It was the perfect, happy, all-American family.
The type of family that went to PTA meetings, the type of family that went to after-school activities.
So when Paul suddenly disappeared, it left everyone in shock.
She said, he just didn't come home. That just really shook me.
I remember combing the desert for hours looking for any sign of him.
He walked out from that truck and simply vanished from the face of the earth.
Would the search for answers expose their perfect all-American family as a facade?
He made the comment, she's trying to get rid of me.
Would a gruesome discovery in the desert reveal the horrifying truth?
There were 61 separate blows to the head.
And would a family's quest for justice come up short?
Why is this woman not in prison for murder?
It was Wednesday morning, October 24th, when 37-year-old Karen Thompson called the police in Avondale, Arizona, a city of 75,000 on the western edge of Phoenix. Karen reported that her husband, 31-year-old Paul Thompson, hadn't come home from work the night before.
Karen wakes up and Paul's not there, and she's frantic.
We were thinking something maybe bad happened to him because he's not the type to just go.
Karen had spent the morning on the phone making worried calls to friends and family.
She called me on the phone and told me that he was missing, and it's just a big surprise.
I said, well, was he really upset or depressed about something? And she said, no, there wasn't anything wrong with him. He just didn't come home. That just really shook me.
None of Karen and Paul's family had any idea where he could be either.
I called a lot of our relations, sisters and brothers and friends, the people that I clean for, to keep Paul in their prayers.
And by mid-morning, Karen had called the police.
She's pretty upset. She didn't know what to do.
We don't know why he's missing or where he's missing.
And a chance discovery on a remote desert roadside would only deepen the mystery surrounding the disappearance of Karen's husband.
It looked like he walked out from that truck and simply vanished from the face of the earth.
Born in 1964, Karen started life far from the desert Southwest.
She is from a little town called Kankakee, Illinois, south of Chicago.
Most everybody around there farmed. It is rural, and we always had things, but country things to do.
And growing up on a farm, Karen could ride almost as soon as she could walk.
She loved horses. She loved being outside and taking care of animals and stuff.
However, the youngest of 6 children, she was just as comfortable in a crowd.
She was always, very outgoing. She made friends easy. She's pretty outspoken.
She'll let you know what she thinks.
And she had brains as well as personality.
She was always really smart, and she was really good in math.
A lot of the people in her family thought that she would end up going into veterinarian school and working with horses.
She might have lived up to those expectations too, if not for the one thing she loved besides horses.
Karen went for bad boys. She was attracted to the type of guys who did not treat her well.
And instead of going to college, Karen moved out to Oklahoma after graduating high school in 1982, hoping to put some distance between herself and a bad breakup.
There were jobs out there, and some other sisters had moved out there, so she went out there too.
In Oklahoma, Karen married and had 2 daughters. But after 6 years of marriage, Karen and her husband divorced.
I don't know a lot about why they separated. I was way too young to even know.
Soon after, she moved to Texas to be near her brother and married a second time. But that didn't last either.
He was in the service, so, he was gone quite a little bit. And when he got out of the service, it didn't work out real well.
And by 1992, after less than 3 years of marriage, Karen had separated from her second husband and was working in the floral department of an Arkansas grocery store, which is how the 27-year-old met Bob Mahala, who'd recently moved to the area.
One of the girls at the register, I asked about horseback riding. She said Her girlfriend in the floral department had 2 horses. So I go to the floral department and I meet Karen.
Newly single, Karen agreed to go riding with Bob.
I just fell for her. She was a very pretty lady and very fun. After riding several times with her, we started dating. And she became pregnant.
Karen divorced her second husband and married Bob in the fall of 1992. But things became troubled almost as soon as Karen and her girls moved in with their new stepfather.
I wasn't ready to be a dad. When here I am a dad. Now I've got a family. These little girls look up to me. They're calling me Dad, Daddy Bob.
They wouldn't be calling him that for long, though. In less than a year, not long after the birth of their son, Bob had bailed on the marriage.
I went down the street and got my own apartment, and I filed for divorce.
Once again, Karen was on her own with 3 kids to raise.
She was very good at making sure we had everything we needed. She always tried her best to do special things for each of us to feel important. So when she was struggling, we didn't know.
Karen, who'd quit her florist job soon after becoming pregnant, started working at the local airport to support her children.
She got a job doing baggage, loading bags onto the plane. It was a temporary job.
But the temporary job inspired the 29-year-old to pursue a new career.
Working at the airport for Karen, it opened her world up and she pursued being a travel agent.
And it was while at school, studying to become a travel agent, that she met the man she'd finally settled down with, Paul Thompson. Six years younger than Karen, Paul had a similar small-town Midwestern upbringing.
He was born in Blue Earth, Minnesota, and he lived in northern Iowa for the first, 13 and a half years of his life.
Although unlike Karen, he was a quiet, introverted child.
So that's why I remember, he didn't have as many friends in school growing up. And I remember majority of his time was spent, in his room reading.
The habit served Paul well in school.
In school, he was a straight-A student.
He's pretty much soaked everything in.
Money was tight, though. So rather than go to college, Paul joined the Army.
Paul went to England for 2 years and to Germany for 2 years.
Inspired by his time overseas, Paul took classes after his discharge to become a travel agent, which was how he met Karen.
She told me one time that he was sitting at the table, and this was when they were in travel agency school. And she said, looking over at him, I just figured, well, he looked like such a nice, quiet guy just sitting there, and I should go over and meet him.
The reserved loner didn't know what to make of it at first.
He was taken aback a bit that a woman who he saw was attractive was engaging him. It was something very different than he had ever dealt with before.
But he certainly appreciated the attention.
Paul really did fall hard for her.
Soon, they were dating.
Opposites attract, and that's probably what attracted him to her.
And not long after her third divorce was finalized, Karen and her 3 children moved in with Paul.
I was mad. I said, wow, that's quick. We're just divorced. And you're already in with this other guy a month later.
But Paul's easygoing nature even won over Karen's ex-husband.
He was very good with the children. And the children liked Paul.
Paul really thought the world of her kids.
And he offered Karen a welcome break from her string of failed relationships.
He represented someone who maybe could provide that stability that she had sought out her entire life.
Karen, Paul, and the kids spent the next 3 years in Missouri. But in 1997, they all moved to Arizona after Paul's brother told him about a job opening.
His brother worked for a telephone company, which sounded pretty good to Paul because he was supporting her and the kids.
Once in Arizona, they settled in Avondale, a quiet suburban community a half-hour west of Phoenix. And after more than 3 years together, Karen and Paul finally married.
He'd wanted to marry her pretty bad.
The wedding was in August of 1998 at a Phoenix hotel.
And it was 115 degrees, and it was an outside wedding, a courtyard wedding.
But no one seemed to mind the heat.
It was really very much a storybook wedding and a very happy day. Everyone saw an optimistic future for this family.
Paul was making good money in the telecommunications field, and Karen found her dream job as a travel agent.
She had booked several different things for me over the years. And she was a very flirtatious, fun type person, So she was always trying to give me the best deal that she could.
And by the fall of 2001, it looked as if that bright future had finally arrived.
They became a very traditional type of family, the type of family that went to PTA meetings, the type of family that went to after-school activities.
It was the perfect, happy, all-American family.
But was it too good to last? Because just months after their third wedding anniversary, Paul would suddenly disappear. Coming up, a passing motorist finds Paul's truck.
The headlights were on and the engine was still running.
But will the truck lead the police to Paul?
I said, "What do we got out there?" And he said, "I've got a mess."
It was a little after midnight on October 24th in the desert north of Phoenix when a passing motorist first noticed the strange truck.
What was so unusual, it was on the side of the road in a remote area. The headlights were on and the engine was still running.
In the middle of taking his girlfriend home after a date, the passerby didn't initially stop. But after dropping off his girlfriend, he drove by the truck again, and it hadn't moved.
45 minutes later, he'd gone to his girlfriend's and it was still running with lights on.
Worried that the driver might be having some sort of emergency, the passerby decided to stop.
He wanted to check it out and see if someone was around there.
But there was no one around. It appeared that the truck's driver had simply abandoned it, with the keys in the ignition and the engine running.
It was just as if he up and walked away.
Puzzled as to why someone would simply leave a truck on the side of the road with the engine running, the passerby called 911. And when deputies from the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office arrived on the scene, they were just as confused as he was.
There's no blood, there's no weapons, there's no signs of foul play. It didn't look like he had been carjacked. There were tools, valuable tools in the truck.
However, running the truck's license plate did provide a couple of crucial clues. The truck's owner, 31-year-old Paul Thompson, lived almost an hour away in Avondale, Arizona. And when the sheriff's deputies contacted Paul's wife, 37-year-old Karen Thompson, she told them that Paul hadn't come home that night.
Once the truck was found, even Karen was worried and upset because it was such a bizarre area for this truck to be.
There was no good explanation as to why Paul would have been in such a remote desert area so far away from home.
However, since there were no signs of foul play, the authorities turned the truck over to Karen and the family.
Paul remained a missing person, and there was no other real evidence.
But the truck did provide Paul's family with a place to start searching for the missing man.
Our son Pete and his wife spent all day out in the desert where the truck was found, trying to find it. See if Paul was out there wandering around.
I just remember combing the desert for hours, looking for any sign of him, any evidence, hoping for something that would lead us in a direction to find him.
Karen and her daughters joined the search too.
They made flyers and stuff and put up, and we were trying to work together.
We walked forever, walking, seeing if we can see him somewhere, passing out flyers at the houses.
But after almost 24 hours of frantic searching, there was no sign of Paul.
They were running into a dead end.
And the search for answers would soon lead investigators to another remote patch of desert and a different sort of dead end. It was the morning of October 25th, the day after Karen reported Paul missing, when a group was out ATV riding in the White Tank Mountains. The 30,000-acre park was 30 minutes north of Avondale and nearly an hour west of where a passerby had found Paul's abandoned truck.
It's a really rocky desert with cactus, and you've got to be careful when you go in there.
Although in this instance, one rider encountered an unexpected obstacle on the trail.
He didn't realize it until he rolled over it that there was a body there.
They discovered a male that had been mutilated, shot, beat up, possibly stabbed. it appears that he has been murdered.
The ATV riders called the authorities, but by the time the Buckeye police arrived, the crime scene had little to offer in the way of clues.
Detective Dave Owens, he'd been out at the scene, he came back and I said, "What do we got out there?" And he said, "I've got a mess."
There were ATV tracks, there were footprints. This was a heavily used recreational area. And any physical evidence that was left around the body had been largely destroyed.
There was no wallet and no ID.
He was just a John Doe. So it really boils down to having to go to the medical examiner's office, collect the fingerprints, and try to run them through a system. And that's going to take time.
And in addition to the fingerprints, the autopsy revealed just how their John Doe had died.
There were 61 separate blows to the head. Blunt force trauma, which fractured his skull.
However, those horrific injuries were only the beginning.
They found stab wounds. They found 3 separate gunshot wounds, one to his back.
Which told the investigators at least one thing about the victim and his killer.
Somebody really hated that guy.
Who was he, though? The dead man's fingerprints weren't in the system, but the killer had left behind a potentially important clue.
The only thing that could possibly identify him is his wedding ring that he was wearing, which had 3 diamonds that were in a diagonal pattern.
And in hopes of finding someone who could identify the man's distinctive ring, the investigators searched the database of recent missing persons reports.
That's where you're going to be able to possibly pull something up.
And they soon came across a potential match.
The body seems to line up with a missing person that had gone missing a few days prior named Paul Thompson.
By that evening, the Buckeye detective was knocking on Karen's door.
They were very anxious to talk to the person who reported him missing.
Karen appeared more than willing to talk to him, too.
Karen seemed very forthright about her husband's disappearance. She told police that she felt that something went wrong, that something is wrong with her husband, that this was not like him, that he was in danger.
The police suspected she was right, that Paul had been in grave danger. Although for the moment, the police didn't reveal why.
They didn't tell her that they had found Paul's body. All they told her is that they had spoken with someone who had information.
However, the detective did ask her about any jewelry Paul might have been wearing.
She described the very unique design on that wedding ring.
It was then that investigators were able to deduce that the body that they had found in the desert, covered with ATV tracks and shrouded in dirt, was the missing Paul Thompson.
But when he shared that suspicion with Karen, a strange thing happened.
She was very weirdly unemotional.
Was Karen simply in shock? Or was it something more?
Everyone grieves differently, but it was an alarm bell for police that Karen seemed so unemotional and detached.
Equally alarming, when the detective began probing for details about the couple's marriage, Karen became defensive.
Karen says, "I know what you're trying to go for, but there weren't any problems in our marriage. We weren't having affairs."
In fact, Karen said she was sure Paul had been faithful to her.
In her words, he's so boring. He would never have the energy or the drive to cheat. Her husband's dead and she's picking him apart. That was very jarring for police.
Although when asked if she'd cheated, Karen quickly changed her tune.
Despite the quirks in the relationship, Karen professed to police that they had a very active and very enjoyable sex life.
Whether that was true or not, Karen's attitude about Paul struck the detective as odd, and that wasn't the only thing that caught his attention either.
When they asked Karen to pin down her own whereabouts for the time that Paul went missing, she said that she was with a friend by the name of Steve.
Karen was adamant that he was just a friend.
Karen tells police that they were, just socializing, that he was going through a divorce, and that she was just trying to be there for him as a friend.
And she told the police that Paul had known all about it.
Karen tells police that Tuesdays in their relationship were set aside for days that they did their own thing.
They respected each other's boundaries. They had time together and they had time apart.
And while Karen said she wasn't sure what Paul had been up to the night before he disappeared, she told the police that she hadn't suspected anything when she got home from dinner with Steve at around 10:30 that Tuesday night.
Paul hadn't come home yet. She wasn't terribly concerned. She went to sleep and figured she'd hear him come in or would see him in the morning.
Of course, Paul hadn't come home, and the police believed his body had just been found, which left them wondering, was Karen telling the truth? Was the mysterious Steve really just a friend? And what, if anything, did he know about Paul's disappearance? Coming up, the investigators tried to track down Karen's friend.
He's left the county, he's left the state.
And they uncover a possible motive.
The amount added up to over $600,000.
October 27, 2001. It had been almost 72 hours since 37-year-old Karen Thompson had reported her husband, Paul, missing.
Her and the girl, they'd been out looking all the places they thought he might go to, and they'd be able to find him or his vehicle, either one, and that he hadn't shown up for work.
And it had been almost 48 hours since Paul's dead body had been found, a half hour from the family's home in Avondale, Arizona.
The number of injuries that Paul sustained and the way that they were inflicted suggests somebody had a score to settle with.
But who might have a score to settle with Paul? After questioning Karen, the lead detective had his suspicions.
There's something about her. He said, just things aren't adding up.
Starting with the man she'd been having dinner with the night her husband disappeared, 35-year-old Steve Richmond.
Police were trying to determine what kind of relationship Karen had with Steve.
And when the investigators went looking for Steve, they soon had even more reason to be suspicious of Karen's friend.
They can't find him anywhere. He's left the county, he's left the state.
Was Steve on the run? Was there more going on between him and Karen than she'd let on? And might it have something to do with her husband's death? While the investigators were trying to track Steve down, they did a little digging into Karen's financials and found some information that suggested they might be on the right track.
Just prior to Paul's death, Karen had taken out 2 life insurance policies on him.
Police had also determined that amount added up to over $600,000.
Was it merely a coincidence that Karen stood to make more than $500,000 off her husband's death? Or was it a motive for murder? When the investigators checked in with Paul's coworkers, they added another piece to the puzzle.
Paul knew his marriage was in trouble. He had confided that to friends, and he believed that his wife was having an affair.
However, that wasn't all Paul's coworkers told the police.
They start hearing some very strange stories about what had been happening to Paul leading up until his death.
Several weeks earlier, while Paul was at work, he bit into a tuna sandwich that he had for lunch, and out of the sandwich oozed mercury that would have been lethal had he swallowed it.
But how had the deadly poison gotten into the sandwich? According to his coworkers, Paul had wondered if someone had tampered with the can of tuna at the factory.
Paul did contact the manufacturer, but he didn't leave a message because he thought it would be too much hassle.
But was there another explanation? One that hit much closer to home. In the break room at work, Paul had laughed it off.
Paul made the comment, Karen made the sandwich, maybe she's trying to get rid of me.
But now that Paul had been murdered, the investigators wondered if it was possible.
Armed with information about Paul nearly being poisoned with mercury and Karen with another man, it was time to sit her down, confront her with some facts, and get some real answers.
It was Monday, October 29th, and Karen was at home with her brother, Vernon, who'd recently arrived from Missouri.
She called me and said, well, they found him, and she told me what had happened. So I loaded up and went to Phoenix right away.
They were in the living room, looking over Paul's insurance paperwork, when the investigators knocked on the door.
Went to the door. When I opened up the door, there was 5 or 6 police officers and detectives. All had guns pointing at me.
The investigators ordered Karen and her brother out of the house.
They had papers with them, and they showed them Karen, and she said, this is a search warrant.
And while one team of investigators went inside to look for evidence, another loaded Karen in the back of a patrol car and took her in for questioning.
It spooked me, but she kept a cool head, and she didn't act like she was too worried when they let her out to the car, where they're not going to find anything.
Had she spoken too soon? Inside the house, the investigators uncovered more evidence that pointed to a possible financial motive.
Looking through the financial records of Paul and Karen, they determined that she had run up $40,000 or $50,000 worth of credit card debt.
You're 50 grand in debt, and you've got this huge policy, and all of a sudden he comes up dead in the middle of the desert, no ID. It really makes you start thinking.
And then there was what the investigators found in the master bedroom.
In a vase near the headboard in the master bedroom, they found a vial of mercury.
Based on what Paul's friends had told police about mercury, they found it very odd. Who has mercury in their house?
It certainly looked suspicious, but since Paul didn't die of mercury poisoning, was it enough?
They needed more. They needed more details. They still couldn't put her at the scene of Paul's murder.
Still, the investigators sat Karen down in the interrogation room and confronted her with what they'd found. But could they get her to crack?
As the heat and the pressure came on to Karen, she changes her story.
First, Karen admitted that she hadn't been honest about her friend, Steve.
Karen revealed that, well, Steve, who was with her, wasn't just a friend. He was her lover. She said at one point they were hot and heavy, but they had since cooled off and they were just friends.
Although she hinted that Steve might have had a hard time accepting that it was over between them.
Karen acknowledged that he loved her so much that he would have killed her husband just to be with her.
And Karen told the police that she feared that Steve had done just that.
Karen revealed that the timeline she gave investigators initially, it wasn't quite right. She admitted that Steve wasn't with her the whole night.
She says, looking back, there was a time that Steve had actually left and that she could not be accountable for where he was, and that she thought that he might have gone out and actually murdered her husband.
Was it the truth? The investigators weren't sure that they believed her, but for the moment, they had little choice but to let Karen go.
Sometimes it's all like a chess game. I make my move, I watch for your move.
So while keeping an eye on Karen, the investigators turned their attention to Steve.
The way it sounded, he was involved in it, but they didn't know how much he had done.
Hoping for some answers, on November 1st, the investigators served a search warrant on Steve's house. And while the investigators were there, Steve suddenly drove up.
Police finally bring him into the interrogation room.
In the interrogation room, Steve told the police that he'd met Karen more than a year earlier.
At this point in his life, Steve was in the middle of a divorce. Karen had been through several bad relationships, and that sort of bonded them at this time where he was struggling and reaching out for some comfort.
Comfort that Karen had provided, according to Steve, who confirmed that he'd been having an affair with Karen.
Very quickly, their relationship went from friendly to flirtatious to adulterous.
And according to Steve, they had been out to dinner the evening that Paul disappeared. However, Steve told the investigators that wasn't the only time he'd seen Karen that night.
In the story that he told, it was very different from what Karen had to say.
Steve said he was at home when Karen called at 11:30.
He told them that Karen called him frantic and distraught.
According to Steve, Karen said she was waiting for him outside, and when he opened the door, he realized that something was wrong.
Steve told police that on the night that Paul went missing, that Karen had Paul's truck.
Steve said that Karen told him she needed his help getting rid of the truck.
Steve didn't question her at that time. He did what she said.
According to Steve, he and Karen had then abandoned Paul's truck along a highway northeast of Phoenix, where a passerby would find it a short time later.
They took all of Paul's property, his wallet, his identification. Steve also took Paul's work computer, which was in his truck.
Then Steve said that once he'd driven Karen back to her car, he'd helped her dispose of what they'd taken, starting with the wallet and IDs.
Steve admitted that at Karen's request, he burned it along with Karen's clothing.
Steve told police that he took the laptop and he threw it off an overpass into the desert.
And there was one more piece of evidence that Steve admitted to getting rid of. And it was the piece that would interest the investigators the most.
The evidence that Steve was told to dispose of included a .380 handgun.
Steve admitted to throwing it into a local lake.
Was it the murder weapon? Steve said it was the gun that killed Paul, but that it wasn't murder.
He said that she and Paul were out in the desert and that Paul attacked her. There was a struggle over a gun and that she killed him in self-defense.
That's what Karen claimed, according to Steve. And the investigators were willing to believe him up to a point.
Although it was clear he was culpable in covering up the crime after the fact, enough of Steve's story added up that police were convinced that he was telling the truth.
But that didn't mean they believed Karen's claim that she'd killed Paul in self-defense.
Because of the numerous conflicting stories, because of the physical evidence, because of Paul being shot in the back, because of the credit cards, because of the insurance policy, because of the mercury, prosecutors were ready to go forward against Karen with a charge of first-degree murder.
And on November 4th, the Buckeye police took Karen into custody, much to the dismay of her 3 children, including her then 17-year-old daughter, Janet.
They didn't say anything to us. They wouldn't tell us because we were kids. My uncle tried to tell me, and we didn't know how to handle the situation that we were in.
And they didn't know how long they would be in that situation, or how long their mother would stay in jail. Coming up, do the prosecutors have enough for a conviction?
This was a classic he said, she said case.
Or will they have to make a hard decision?
Why is this woman not in prison for murder?
Since Karen Thompson's husband, Paul, had been found dead an hour from the couple's Avondale, Arizona home.
He was shot, he was stabbed, he was clubbed about the head.
Paul's family was convinced that Karen was behind the murder.
She'd been having this affair for a year.
There was no one else that I could see that would want to kill him.
And the authorities agreed. They'd arrested the 37-year-old for murder after questioning her lover, Steve Richmond.
Steve's story to police was that on the night that Paul went missing, Karen had called him and asked him to come and help dispose of some evidence.
Evidence that included Paul's wallet, his laptop, and a handgun.
He admitted to throwing it into a local lake where it was never recovered.
The investigators had been able to recover Paul's computer, though.
Steve was able to tell detectives exactly where he dropped the laptop over the overpass.
But did that mean he'd merely helped Karen dispose of the evidence as he'd claimed? Not according to Karen. Questioned after her arrest, she told the police that Steve was framing her for the murder.
She pointed the finger at Steve, saying that she had nothing to do with it and that Steve was Paul's killer.
This was a classic he said, she said case. Although police had a body and they knew how Paul was killed, there was no way to determine who had killed him. There was no forensics linking anyone to the crime.
The remote desert site where Paul's body had been dumped yielded no clues.
Because ATVs had passed through, this crime scene had been contaminated.
And the same was true of Paul's abandoned truck.
The police actually returned it to Karen without any evidence being extracted from it, with any processing or analysis by the police.
After the truck was turned back over to Karen, it essentially rendered the truck useless as evidence.
And that put the prosecutors in a serious bind.
Prosecutors couldn't make a case against Karen without some evidence that put her on the crime scene.
Prosecutors were forced to let her go.
Paul's family was horrified.
It gave us kind of an eerie feeling. If she had done that to Paul, was she going to come after us?
Although once out of jail, Karen left the Phoenix area and returned to Missouri.
She moved in with my sister, which is just about a mile up the road here.
And she did her best to put Paul's death behind her.
She really didn't want to talk about it, after she'd moved here. I think she didn't want to be bothered with it anymore.
And in January, Just 3 months after her husband's murder, Karen married yet again.
That seemed pretty strange to me.
She married this Mr. Sanchez. He had done a little prison time, had a record. Wasn't the nicest guy in town, but she fell for him. How she met him, I don't know. But I was appalled after she killed her husband, she married him. That sends a red flag to every and anybody.
And Karen's behavior would soon be even more alarming. It all started shortly after Karen's arrest, when her third husband had received temporary custody of their 8-year-old son, Karen's youngest.
And it was a shock to get that phone call that the girl that you were married to murdered somebody.
And while the charges had been dropped and Karen was out of jail, Bob was preparing to sue for full custody of their son anyway. But Karen had other plans.
She called me to meet at McDonald's and said she wanted to see her son. She could drive down here. I agreed. I felt for her. Every child misses their mom. My son missed his mom. He cried at night. So I said, let's have lunch with your mom at McDonald's.
They met on the afternoon of February 24th, 2002.
He came in the door with the little boy and Karen and her 16-year-old daughter at the time. And 2 guys were in there. And the guys maced Bob.
I was trying to do a good thing because my son missed his mother. And it ended up backfiring, where my son got kidnapped.
Karen grabbed the boy and ran out the other door, and he started getting up, and they maced him again.
And I had to call the cops, but I couldn't see the phone because I was maced.
Eventually, Bob did manage to call the police.
There was all points bulletin out for her, and they got as far up as 20 or 30 miles to the town north of Springfield.
And they might have gone farther if the police hadn't caught up with Karen.
They arrested her, but then they didn't know for sure who had custody of the little boy. And they released her, and they never brought any charges.
Bob did eventually get his son back, but the entire experience left him rattled, to say the least.
I'm livid. Why is this woman not in prison for murder? She already killed one guy. We couldn't figure it out, but the detective was telling me they're waiting for forensics. That's all he kept saying. We just gotta wait, we've gotta wait. Not enough evidence yet.
Although, as it turned out, Karen's ex wouldn't have too long to wait. In May of 2002, 6 months after her initial arrest for murder, and less than 3 months after she attempted to abduct her son, the authorities in Arizona were finally ready to act.
They cut a deal with Steve.
Apparently, her ex-lover Steve hadn't appreciated the fact that she had involved him in a murder, painted him as the killer, and then run off and married another man.
Police are able to convince him to testify against Karen.
And in May, the police were once again at Karen's door.
They busted her door down and arrested her for Paul's murder. It was a relief when I knew she was behind bars. She couldn't do any more to hurt any of our family anymore.
But did they have enough to make murder charges stick? Coming up, the prosecution appears confident.
Prosecutors sought the death penalty against Karen.
But is their confidence misplaced?
One juror, shadow of a doubt, and she walks.
Husband Paul Thompson had been found dead in the Arizona desert. 40-year-old Karen Sanchez was finally in court to face murder charges.
I just remember frustration that it seemed like it took forever to charge her and to get on with the process.
The breakthrough came when Karen's former lover, Steve Richmond, had agreed to cooperate with the prosecutors.
Steve, in exchange for a very favorable outcome, would testify against Karen, and he would tell a jury about what she confessed to him.
Although once he agreed to testify, his account of Karen's confession had changed, dropping her claim that she had killed Paul in self-defense.
Steve, in his deposition, said that she had wanted to get rid of him. She didn't want to go through another divorce. She'd been through too much. She had too much to lose.
Look at what Karen stood to gain. Money from a life insurance policy, a home, autonomy.
And unlike Karen's earlier arrest, the prosecutors had witnesses who could back up Steve's claims.
People are pointing the finger at Karen, saying that she had tried to hire them to kill her husband.
But none of them would take her up on it. They said they weren't into doing something like that.
But their testimony, combined with Steve's, could make all the difference.
That she had offered them money to try and kill her husband. Those facts together supported the prosecution's case.
And the fact that she'd tried to hire a hitman might have ended up costing Karen dearly.
Prosecutors sought the death penalty.
But that didn't mean they would get it.
This definitely wasn't a slam dunk case. It wasn't a sure thing for prosecutors.
They realized that they had a compromise if they were certain of getting any conviction at all.
So with her trial date approaching, the prosecutors had contacted Karen's defense attorney and offered her a deal.
Plead guilty for second-degree murder for a 20-year flat sentence.
It was a bitter disappointment for Paul's family, but they felt there was little choice.
They said, do you want to take the chance to go to a trial? And takes one juror, shadow of a doubt, and she walks.
That made it pretty much an easy decision at that point.
On December 21st, Karen took the deal.
She pled guilty to second-degree murder with a stipulated sentence of 20 calendar years in prison with no early release.
She'll be 57 when she gets out.
But is that enough? Especially considering how Paul died.
Paul Thompson endured a horrific and violent death.
And then there was the senseless nature of the crime. After 3 divorces, why did Karen decide that Paul had to die?
That's what I've tried to ask myself, for 15 years now. Why not just walk away?
On the morning of May 31st, 2009, George Wayne Tiller went to church in Wichita, Kansas, as he had done before. It was a Sunday morning, a time ordinarily associated with worship, family, community, and the quiet routines of faith. But before the morning was over, that familiar setting would become the scene of a deliberate killing that would reverberate far beyond the walls of the church. Tiller, an obstetrician-gynecologist known throughout the United States for providing abortion services, including services involving later-stage pregnancies, was shot and killed inside Reformation Lutheran Church. The man who killed him was Scott Philip Roeder, a deeply anti-abortion individual whose hostility toward Tiller had developed within an intensely ideological view of abortion. The location of the murder was not incidental to the shock that followed. Tiller was not attacked at the clinic where his professional work had made him a highly controversial figure. He was not killed during a protest, nor during a confrontation in the street. He was killed inside a church on a Sunday morning. That single fact would become one of the defining images of the case. A physician who had spent years at the center of a bitter national controversy had sought a place of worship, only to encounter violence there. The story of George Tiller and Scott Roeder is therefore not simply the story of one man killing another. It is the story of how an ideological conflict can become so absolute in the mind of an individual that another person's life is reduced to an obstacle that must be removed. To understand what happened that morning, however, it is necessary to understand the man who died and the environment in which he had lived for years. George Wayne Tiller was a physician in Wichita, Kansas. His professional life placed him at the center of one of the most divisive issues in American society: abortion. Because he provided abortion services, Tiller became the target of intense opposition. His clinic was a place where people with profoundly different beliefs confronted one another, sometimes through demonstrations and disputes. Across the country, abortion had become more than a medical or legal question. For many people, it was inseparable from morality, religion, politics, and deeply held beliefs about human life. Tiller stood directly within that conflict. His work made him a nationally recognized figure, but it also made him a target. The hostility directed toward him was not merely verbal. In 1993, years before the events of May 2009, Tiller had already survived an act of violence when he was shot. He lived through that attack, but the fact that he had previously been targeted is an important part of the story. By 2009, the possibility of danger was not an abstract concept surrounding his professional life. It was something that had already become part of his reality. Yet despite that history, his life was not defined only by the threats surrounding his medical work. On the morning of May 31st, he was at his church. The setting matters because it creates a stark contrast with the image of Tiller that had developed in the public imagination. To supporters of abortion rights, he was a physician providing medical services in a controversial field. To opponents, particularly those who regarded abortion as an intolerable moral wrong, he represented something very different. Scott Roeder belonged to the latter world of thought. Born in Kansas in 1958, Roeder developed strong anti-abortion beliefs and was associated with networks and groups characterized by anti-government and anti-abortion extremism. His hostility toward Tiller was rooted in the belief that the doctor was doing something profoundly wrong. Roeder did not simply disagree with Tiller's profession. According to the facts surrounding the case, he viewed Tiller's work as an act that needed to be stopped. That distinction is critical. Societies can contain intense political, religious, and moral disagreements without those disagreements becoming acts of violence. People can condemn an action, protest against it, campaign against it, or seek to change the laws surrounding it. Roeder crossed a different boundary. His belief became connected to the conviction that he personally had to intervene. Eventually, that conviction would lead him to the church where Tiller was present that Sunday morning. The precise moment when an ideology becomes a justification for violence is difficult to define from the outside, but the consequences can be unmistakable. In this case, the consequence was the death of a physician inside a place of worship. Roeder was not an unknown figure to law enforcement. He had previously been involved in conduct that brought him into contact with authorities and had been arrested before. More importantly, the case that emerged after May 31st showed that his hostility toward Tiller was not a sudden disagreement that appeared in the final seconds of the encounter. Roeder had developed his opposition to Tiller within his broader anti-abortion beliefs, and he would later acknowledge that he killed Tiller because of the abortion issue. That admission would become one of the central elements in understanding the motive behind the murder. But on that Sunday morning, the future trial and federal investigation had not yet happened. There was only the church, the people inside it, and the presence of two men whose paths were about to intersect in a way that would permanently alter both their lives. Tiller was there to participate in church life. Roeder arrived in the area carrying a firearm. According to the established account of the case, Roeder entered the church and shot Tiller. Tiller was killed. Roeder then left the scene. The violence itself was brief, but its meaning was much larger. A murder committed in a church carries a particular kind of shock because the location is ordinarily associated with safety, worship, and community. For Tiller, the place where he had gone that morning offered no protection from the ideology that had followed him throughout his professional life. The murder immediately raised questions that extended beyond the identity of the shooter. Why had Tiller been targeted? Why had Roeder decided that killing him was justified? And what did the attack mean for other physicians and facilities connected to reproductive health? Those questions would soon become matters for investigators, prosecutors, and federal authorities. The United States Department of Justice would open a federal investigation, examining whether the killing involved violations of federal laws protecting reproductive health providers and facilities. But before those questions could be answered, law enforcement had to determine what had happened and who was responsible. Roeder had left the church, but he would not remain free for long. Investigators quickly focused on him, and the evidence would point toward a deliberate act rather than a random encounter. The killing of George Tiller would eventually end in a courtroom, where Roeder would attempt to frame his actions through the moral beliefs that had motivated him. The law, however, would confront that justification with a different principle. Personal conviction does not give an individual the right to decide that another human being should die. That conflict between belief and law would become central to the case. Yet the story begins before the courtroom, before the federal investigation, and before the verdict. It begins on a Sunday morning in Wichita, with George Tiller inside his church and Scott Roeder approaching with a weapon. The tragedy of the case lies partly in how ordinary that morning was supposed to be. There was nothing extraordinary about the basic act of going to church. But for Tiller, the morning would end in death. For Roeder, it would begin the process that would ultimately lead to a conviction for first-degree murder and a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. And for the wider public, the killing would become a disturbing example of what can happen when an ideological conflict is transformed into a personal justification for violence. The murder would also remind authorities that the danger did not necessarily end with the death of one prominent physician. In the weeks and months that followed, concern remained over threats and violence directed toward abortion providers and facilities. The federal government would therefore treat the case not simply as an isolated homicide, but within the broader context of violence surrounding reproductive health services. George Tiller's death began with a gunshot inside a church, but the questions it raised reached far beyond that building. They concerned the boundaries between conviction and extremism, protest and violence, disagreement and murder. Above all, they concerned a basic fact that no ideology could change. George Tiller was a human being who went to church on a Sunday morning, and he was killed because another man had convinced himself that his own beliefs gave him the right to take Tiller's life. To understand why the murder of George Wayne Tiller became such a significant case, it is necessary to look beyond the moment when his life ended and examine the circumstances that had made him such a visible figure long before May 31st, 2009. Tiller was an obstetrician-gynecologist in Wichita, Kansas, and his professional work placed him directly at the center of one of the most bitter and enduring conflicts in American public life: the debate over abortion. He provided abortion services, including services involving later-stage pregnancies, and because of that work, he became known throughout the United States. His name was not unfamiliar to people on either side of the abortion debate. To those who supported access to abortion, he was a physician performing medical services in an area where patients faced difficult and often deeply personal circumstances. To those who opposed abortion, his work represented something they believed was profoundly wrong. The disagreement surrounding him was therefore not simply a disagreement about one doctor. Tiller had become a symbol within a much larger national argument, and symbols can attract a level of attention and hostility that goes far beyond the individual person behind the name. His clinic in Wichita became a place where opposing convictions repeatedly came into contact. Protests and confrontations occurred there, reflecting the intensity of the broader abortion controversy. The atmosphere surrounding Tiller was consequently shaped by public opposition and threats, and the hostility toward him was not merely theoretical. In 1993, Tiller was shot and survived. That earlier attack is one of the most important facts in understanding the danger that had surrounded his professional life. Long before Scott Roeder entered the church in 2009, Tiller had already experienced violence because of his work. The fact that he survived the 1993 shooting did not erase what had happened. It demonstrated that opposition to his medical practice had, at least once before, crossed the boundary from protest and confrontation into an attempt to cause physical harm. By the time of his death 16 years later, Tiller had become accustomed to living with a level of caution and security that would be difficult to imagine for most people. Yet it would be misleading to define his entire life only through the threats surrounding his profession. The available facts tell us that on May 31st, 2009, Tiller went to his church in Wichita. That detail is especially important because it reminds us that the man who became the center of a national controversy also had an ordinary human life beyond the arguments surrounding his medical practice. He was not at his clinic that morning. He was not participating in a public confrontation. He was at Reformation Lutheran Church, a place where he regularly worshipped. The contrast between that setting and the controversy that surrounded him would become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. The same man who had been publicly identified with one of America's most divisive issues was, on that Sunday morning, simply present in his church. But the forces that had surrounded his professional life did not remain confined to his workplace. The man who would kill him was Scott Philip Roeder. Born in Kansas in 1958, Roeder developed strongly anti-abortion beliefs and became associated with networks and groups characterized by anti-government and anti-abortion extremism. His beliefs were not merely an abstract political position. They became central to the way he viewed Tiller. According to the facts surrounding the case, Roeder regarded the doctor's work as something that was morally unacceptable and believed Tiller was doing something that needed to be stopped. That belief provides the essential connection between the broader controversy over abortion and the individual act of murder that followed. It is important, however, to distinguish between a person's political or moral position and the decision to use violence. People can hold intense beliefs about abortion, religion, government, or any other social issue without committing crimes. The defining feature of Roeder's conduct was that his opposition did not stop at belief. He ultimately acted upon it. In doing so, he transformed an ideological conflict into a personal attack against another human being. Roeder also was not completely unknown to law enforcement before the killing. The supplied record indicates that he had engaged in conduct that had previously brought him into contact with authorities and that he had been arrested before. Those earlier encounters did not prevent the later attack. More significant for the Tiller case was the development of Roeder's hostility toward the physician. The available facts establish that Roeder particularly hated Tiller because of his belief that the doctor was carrying out acts Roeder considered to be crimes. That perception became the foundation for the decision he would eventually make. There is a profound difference between believing that another person is wrong and believing that one has the authority to punish that person personally. Roeder crossed that boundary. His later admission that he killed Tiller because of the abortion issue made the ideological motive especially clear. The murder was not presented as the result of a financial dispute, a personal argument unrelated to politics, or a random encounter. It emerged from a belief about abortion and from Roeder's conviction that Tiller represented what he opposed. That is why Tiller's identity mattered so much to the attacker. Roeder did not encounter an unknown stranger and suddenly decide to kill him. He had formed an opinion about Tiller and about the work he performed. Tiller had become, in Roeder's view, a personification of the practice he opposed. Once another human being is reduced to a symbol, the danger is that the person himself can disappear behind the ideology. The case would later demonstrate the consequences of that transformation. Tiller's profession had made him controversial, but controversy did not make him responsible for the violence directed against him. His work could be debated. His medical practice could be criticized. His opponents could seek changes in law and public policy. None of those forms of disagreement gave anyone the right to take his life. That distinction would become crucial when Roeder was eventually brought before a court. His defense of the killing would attempt to connect his actions to his moral opposition to abortion, but the legal system would have to determine whether such a belief could excuse or justify murder. Before that question reached the courtroom, however, the conflict between Tiller and Roeder had to reach its final and fatal point. On May 31, 2009, Tiller went to Reformation Lutheran Church in Wichita. Roeder also came to the area, carrying a firearm. What happened next would transform the history of both men. Tiller, who had already survived an attack 16 years earlier, would not survive this one. His death would immediately become a national story, and the fact that it occurred inside a church would deepen the shock. For those who knew Tiller as a physician, the killing meant the loss of a person who had continued working despite years of opposition and danger. For law enforcement, it represented a murder whose motive appeared directly connected to extremist opposition to abortion. And for the wider public, it became a stark warning about what can happen when an ideological conviction is transformed into a personal mandate for violence. George Tiller's life before the murder cannot be separated from the controversy surrounding his profession. But neither should that controversy be allowed to erase the person himself. He was a physician. He was a member of a church community. He was a man who had already survived violence once. And on the morning of May 31st, he entered a place of worship believing he was continuing an ordinary part of his life. Instead, the hostility that had surrounded his professional work followed him into that sanctuary. By the time the investigation began, the central facts were already becoming clear. Tiller had been deliberately targeted, and the man responsible was motivated by an extreme opposition to abortion. The next question would be how investigators would reconstruct what happened, how quickly they would identify Roeder, and how the legal system would confront a defendant who did not deny the killing but sought to frame it through his own beliefs. Scott Philip Roeder did not enter the story as a man who happened to cross paths with George Tiller by chance. By the time the two men encountered one another on May 31st, 2009, Roeder had already developed a deeply hostile view of abortion and, more specifically, of the physician he associated with it. Born in Kansas in 1958, Roeder had become strongly opposed to abortion and had moved within networks characterized by anti-government and anti-abortion extremism. Those beliefs formed the background against which the murder of Tiller would eventually be understood. Yet ideology by itself does not automatically lead to violence. Millions of people can hold intense moral or political beliefs without ever harming another person. The significance of Roeder's story lies in the point where his beliefs became something more than an opinion. They became, in his mind, a reason to act against another human being. To understand that transformation, it is important to focus on what is established about Roeder rather than turning him into a fictional character. The available facts do not require dramatic speculation about his private thoughts. His own actions and later statements provide the essential evidence. Roeder believed that abortion was profoundly wrong. He viewed George Tiller as a person who was actively participating in what he considered an unacceptable practice. Over time, that perception hardened into hostility toward Tiller himself. The doctor was no longer simply someone whose professional decisions Roeder opposed. In Roeder's worldview, Tiller represented the practice Roeder wanted to stop. That distinction would become critical because it changed the nature of the conflict. A person can oppose a medical practice and campaign against it. A person can protest outside a clinic, argue for different laws, or attempt to persuade others. Those activities remain within the boundaries of political and social disagreement, provided they are lawful. Roeder's path went somewhere else. His opposition became personalized. He focused his anger on Tiller, and the physician eventually became the target of an act of deliberate violence. The record also indicates that Roeder had previously come into contact with law enforcement and had been arrested before the murder. That history did not make him a murderer by itself, and it should not be treated as proof that his later actions were inevitable. What matters is that Roeder was not completely disconnected from the legal system before May 2009. His previous encounters with authorities existed alongside the increasingly extreme ideological environment in which he operated. The combination would become relevant after the murder because investigators and prosecutors would have to understand not only what Roeder had done, but why he had done it. The motive was not difficult to identify. Roeder later acknowledged that he had killed Tiller because of the abortion issue. That admission would become one of the clearest indications that the murder was ideologically motivated. The question was therefore not simply whether Roeder had fired the fatal shot. It was whether his belief system had become the driving force behind a deliberate decision to kill. The facts surrounding the case indicate that it had. Roeder had developed a particular hatred for Tiller because he believed the physician was doing something morally criminal. This is an important distinction in cases involving extremism. A violent offender may convince himself that the person he targets is not merely an opponent but an enemy whose existence represents an unacceptable wrong. Once that happens, the offender can begin to see violence not as a crime, but as a form of intervention. That is the danger of moral absolutism when combined with a willingness to use force. Roeder's later attempt to justify his conduct would make this especially clear. He did not simply claim that he had accidentally caused Tiller's death. He acknowledged the killing while attempting to present his action as something that, in his view, was necessary because of abortion. The reasoning was deeply disturbing because it placed his own moral judgment above the life of another person and above the law. In Roeder's mind, the issue was no longer whether Tiller's medical work should be permitted. He had moved toward the belief that Tiller himself needed to be stopped. That belief set the stage for the events of May 31st. George Tiller had spent years working in an environment of intense opposition. He had survived a shooting in 1993, demonstrating that hostility toward him had already crossed into physical violence once before. By 2009, his name was closely associated with the abortion debate, particularly because of the services he provided in Wichita. Roeder's ideological hostility, therefore, had a specific target. He did not need to search for an abstract symbol of the abortion debate. In his mind, Tiller embodied it. The decision to target a specific person is what transformed Roeder's ideology into a direct threat. On the morning of May 31st, Roeder came to the area of Reformation Lutheran Church carrying a firearm. Tiller was inside the church. The circumstances were not those of an unexpected argument between two strangers. According to the established account, Roeder deliberately approached Tiller and shot him. He then left the scene. The speed of the physical act did not mean that the underlying decision had been spontaneous. The subsequent investigation would establish that Roeder had intentionally sought Tiller and that the murder was connected to his anti-abortion beliefs. That distinction would later become central to the question of first-degree murder. The legal system would have to determine whether Roeder had acted with the kind of premeditation necessary for that charge. But even before the courtroom, the ideological motive provided investigators with an important path toward understanding the crime. The killing also demonstrated the difference between rhetoric and action. Strong language, demonstrations, and political conflict can be disturbing, but they remain fundamentally different from taking a person's life. Roeder crossed that line. His beliefs became an instrument through which he justified an irreversible act. The consequences were immediate for Tiller and permanent for everyone connected to him. The murder also had implications beyond the two men. Because Tiller was a reproductive health provider who had been targeted in an ideologically motivated attack, authorities had to consider whether the killing might signal a broader threat to similar providers and facilities. The concern was not limited to Wichita. Federal officials would soon become involved, examining whether the case implicated laws designed to protect access to reproductive health services and the people who provide them. In that sense, Roeder's individual decision became part of a much larger law enforcement concern. The case was no longer only about one physician and one attacker. It raised questions about how extremist individuals can act independently, how ideological hostility can become violence, and how authorities can protect people who have become targets because of their professional roles. Yet the most important point remains the simplest. Roeder was responsible for his own actions. His beliefs may explain his motive, but they do not transfer responsibility to an ideology, a movement, or the people he claimed to oppose. The murder was his decision. He later acknowledged that decision himself. And the fact that he believed he was acting for a moral purpose would become one of the most troubling aspects of the case. When someone becomes convinced that his personal interpretation of morality gives him permission to kill, the normal boundaries between disagreement and violence begin to collapse. George Tiller had been controversial because of his medical work, But controversy did not make him an enemy who could legally be destroyed. Roeder's decision to treat him that way was the decisive step that transformed ideological opposition into murder. By the time investigators began reconstructing the events of May 31st, they were confronted with a case in which motive and action were closely connected. Tiller was dead. Roeder had fled. But the investigation would soon begin to close the distance between them. Police would locate Roeder, identify him as the suspect, and uncover the evidence that would make the central question increasingly clear. This was not a random act committed in a moment of confusion. It was a deliberate killing rooted in an ideology that Roeder had allowed to override the most basic boundary of all, the boundary between believing another person is wrong and deciding that person should no longer live. May 31st, 2009, began as a Sunday morning in Wichita, Kansas. For George Wayne Tiller, the day brought him to Reformation Lutheran Church, a place where he regularly worshiped. His professional life had made him one of the most recognizable abortion providers in the United States, and his work had placed him in the middle of an intensely divisive national conflict. But the church was separate from that professional world. On this morning, Tiller was not at his clinic. He was not confronting protesters or participating in a public dispute. He was at church. Scott Philip Roeder, however, had also come to the area. He was carrying a firearm, and his opposition to abortion had already developed into a particular hostility toward Tiller. What happened next would turn an ordinary Sunday into the final morning of Tiller's life. The shooting itself was brief. According to the established facts of the case, Roeder entered the church and shot Tiller. The physician was killed inside the building. Roeder then left the scene. There was no prolonged confrontation described in the supplied account, no extended exchange between the two men, and no evidence that this was an accidental encounter that suddenly became violent. Instead, the facts point toward a deliberate act directed against a specific individual. That distinction would become central to everything that followed. The location of the killing made the event particularly shocking. Tiller had spent years working in a field that generated fierce opposition, and his clinic had been the site of demonstrations and confrontations. Because of that history, violence against him might have been associated in the public mind with the highly charged environment surrounding his professional work. But he was not killed there. He was killed inside a church. The place where he had gone to worship became the place where he was murdered. That contrast gave the case a significance that extended beyond the immediate circumstances of the shooting. A church is ordinarily understood as a place of worship and community. Tiller's presence there represented a part of his life that existed outside the political arguments surrounding his profession, yet the hostility directed toward him followed him into that setting. His death demonstrated how far an ideological conflict could extend when an individual no longer separated political disagreement from personal violence. The immediate aftermath required law enforcement to determine what had happened and identify the person responsible. Roeder left the church after the shooting and drove away from Wichita. He did not remain at the scene. Police, however, were able to locate his vehicle, and Roeder was arrested. The speed with which authorities identified and apprehended him meant that the investigation quickly moved beyond the basic question of who had committed the shooting. The more difficult question was why. In many homicide investigations, determining motive can require investigators to reconstruct complicated personal relationships, financial disputes, histories of conflict, or hidden circumstances. In the Tiller case, the motive was closely connected to Roeder's known beliefs. His opposition to abortion was already established, and his hostility toward Tiller was directly connected to the physician's work. Roeder later acknowledged that he had killed Tiller because of the abortion issue. That admission would make the ideological nature of the murder especially difficult to dispute. It also meant that investigators could examine the crime within the larger context of anti-abortion extremism and previous threats directed at reproductive health providers. Tiller's own history made the investigation even more significant. He had already survived a shooting in 1993. The fact that he had been attacked years earlier demonstrated that the hostility surrounding his work was capable of producing physical violence. His death in 2009, therefore, could not be viewed entirely in isolation from the environment that had surrounded him for years. The investigators had to consider whether this was an isolated act by one individual or part of a broader threat facing others in the same profession. The federal government would soon take that question seriously. On June 5th, only days after the murder, the United States Department of Justice announced that its Civil Rights Division and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Kansas had opened a federal investigation. Authorities examined whether the killing involved violations of federal law, including the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, commonly known as the FACE Act, or other federal statutes. The federal investigation placed the murder within a larger legal framework. Tiller's death was still a homicide under Kansas law, but federal authorities also had an interest in determining whether the attack represented violence connected to the provision of reproductive health services. The significance of that question extended beyond Tiller himself. If an individual could be targeted because of his professional role, then other doctors, staff members, and facilities might also face danger. The federal government's response reflected concern about that broader possibility. It was also an indication that authorities understood the murder as more than a private dispute. Roeder's motive was ideological, and ideological violence can have consequences that reach far beyond the immediate victim. When an individual kills someone because that person represents a particular practice or belief, others associated with the same practice can become potential targets. That was one reason the case attracted federal attention and why the government emphasized protection for people and facilities at risk. The investigation also had to address the question of intent. Roeder did not claim that he had never shot Tiller. Instead, his position centered on the idea that his actions were morally justified because of his opposition to abortion. That argument would later become important in court. But from the perspective of the investigation, the existence of such a belief did not erase the physical facts of what had occurred. Tiller had been deliberately targeted and killed. Roeder had left the scene and was later apprehended. His motivation was tied to an ideological opposition that he had held before the murder. Those elements provided investigators with a coherent picture of the crime. The distinction between justification and explanation would become increasingly important. Roeder's beliefs could explain why he acted, but they could not automatically justify the act under the law. A person can believe with absolute certainty that another person is doing something wrong and still have no legal authority to kill that person. That principle would eventually become one of the foundations of the prosecution's case. The events of May 31st also had an immediate symbolic effect. Tiller's murder demonstrated that violence connected to the abortion controversy was not confined to demonstrations, threats, or confrontations at medical facilities. The attack had reached a church. It had reached a location that was not the center of Tiller's professional activity. And it had taken the life of a man who had already survived violence once before. The shock was therefore not limited to those who knew Tiller. The killing raised concerns about the safety of other reproductive health providers and facilities. Across the country, federal authorities were conscious that the murder might encourage additional acts of violence or threats from individuals holding similar extremist beliefs. The case involving Gregory Hertz, who was accused of threatening an abortion clinic in Boulder, Colorado, approximately 3 weeks after Tiller's murder, would later illustrate why such concerns mattered. Hertz eventually pleaded guilty to the relevant threat charges. The murder itself, however, remained centered on the actions of Scott Roeder. He had gone to the church carrying a firearm. He had targeted Tiller. He had shot him. And he had left. Those basic facts established the foundation for the legal proceedings that would follow. The investigation would not have to solve an unknown murder for months or years. The suspect had been identified and arrested quickly, and his own later acknowledgement connected the killing directly to his anti-abortion beliefs. The questions now shifted toward the courtroom. Was the killing planned? Did Roeder act with the intent required for first-degree murder? Could his claimed moral opposition to abortion have any legal force? And how should the justice system respond when a defendant admits to killing a person but insists that his ideology made the act necessary? Those questions would soon determine the course of the trial. But before the courtroom arguments began, the central fact of the case remained painfully simple. On a Sunday morning in Wichita, George Tiller entered his church. Scott Roeder came there with a weapon. Tiller was shot and killed, and Roeder fled. What began as an ideological conflict surrounding one of America's most divisive issues had become an irreversible act of violence. The investigation would now attempt to reconstruct the path from belief to murder, while federal authorities considered the wider threat to reproductive health providers. And ultimately, a jury would have to decide whether Roeder's actions constituted first-degree murder. The church had been the setting for the crime. The courtroom would become the setting in which the meaning and legal consequences of that crime were finally confronted. The investigation into the murder of George Wayne Tiller began with a crime that, at first glance, appeared brutally simple. A physician had been shot inside his church, the suspect had fled, and law enforcement needed to locate him. But beneath those basic facts lay a more complicated question. Why had Scott Roeder targeted Tiller? The answer would shape not only the prosecution of Roeder, but also the way authorities understood the murder within the broader context of violence surrounding abortion providers. Tiller had spent years at the center of an intense national controversy. His work as an obstetrician-gynecologist, including providing abortion services involving later-stage pregnancies, had made him a prominent target of opposition. He had previously survived a shooting in 1993, and by 2009 his professional life existed within an environment of demonstrations, hostility, and threats. When he was killed on May 31st, however, the attack did not occur at his clinic. It occurred inside Reformation Lutheran Church in Wichita. That fact immediately raised the significance of the case. Investigators were not simply examining an attack against a controversial doctor. They were examining the deliberate killing of a reproductive health provider by a man whose opposition to abortion was already known. Scott Roeder had left the church after shooting Tiller. He drove away from Wichita, but his escape did not last long. Authorities located his vehicle and arrested him. The rapid arrest meant that investigators could quickly move from identifying the suspected killer to examining the circumstances surrounding the murder. The central issue was not merely whether Roeder had fired the fatal shot. The facts surrounding the case pointed toward his responsibility, and Roeder would eventually acknowledge that he had killed Tiller. The more important investigative question concerned intent. Was this a random act? Had Roeder encountered Tiller unexpectedly and reacted in a moment of uncontrolled anger? Or had he deliberately targeted the physician because of his opposition to abortion? The evidence described in the case pointed toward the third explanation. Roeder had developed a particular hostility toward Tiller because he believed the physician was doing something morally unacceptable. His opposition to abortion was not a belief that appeared for the first time on the day of the murder. It had become part of his worldview, and Tiller had become one of the individuals he associated most strongly with the practice he opposed. That ideological connection gave investigators a clear motive. Roeder later admitted that abortion was the reason he killed Tiller. His statement was significant because it removed much of the uncertainty that might otherwise surround the motive in a homicide investigation. There was no need to invent a private dispute between the two men or search for an unrelated personal explanation. The motive was ideological. Roeder believed Tiller's work was wrong, and he had decided that the physician needed to be stopped. The investigation, therefore, had to examine the boundary between ideological opposition and deliberate criminal conduct. That boundary would later become especially important at trial, because Roeder attempted to present his actions through the framework of his own moral beliefs. He did not simply deny responsibility. Instead, he acknowledged the killing while suggesting that he had acted out of a sense of moral necessity. For investigators and prosecutors, however, a defendant's personal conviction could explain an action without making the action lawful. The fact that Roeder believed he was doing something necessary did not alter the fundamental fact that he had intentionally taken another person's life. The investigation also had to consider the significance of Roeder's prior history. The supplied facts indicate that he had previously been involved in conduct that brought him into contact with law enforcement and that he had been arrested before. That history provided context, but it was not itself the explanation for Tiller's murder. The central connection remained his extremist opposition to abortion and his hostility toward Tiller. Investigators were therefore faced with a case in which motive, target, and act were closely aligned. Tiller was a prominent abortion provider. Roeder was strongly opposed to abortion. Roeder particularly hated Tiller because of the doctor's work. Roeder came to the church carrying a firearm. Tiller was shot and killed. Roeder left the scene and was subsequently arrested. And later, Roeder acknowledged that he had killed Tiller because of the abortion issue. Together, those facts formed a coherent picture of an ideologically motivated homicide. But the investigation did not stop with the state criminal case. Within days, the federal government became involved. On June 5, 2009, the United States Department of Justice announced that its Civil Rights Division and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Kansas had opened a federal investigation into the murder. Federal authorities examined whether the killing could constitute a violation of federal laws, including the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, commonly known as the FACE Act, or other federal statutes. The federal investigation reflected a broader concern. Tiller was not simply an individual who happened to have been killed because of a personal dispute. He was a physician whose work involved reproductive health services, and his murder appeared connected directly to opposition toward that work. Federal authorities therefore had to consider whether the case belonged within a larger pattern of threats and violence directed against reproductive health providers and facilities. That concern was particularly important because an ideologically motivated attacker can potentially regard other people in the same profession as representatives of the same cause. If one physician can become a target because of the service he provides, then the danger may extend beyond one individual. The Justice Department's response, therefore, included attention to the safety of people and facilities that could be vulnerable to similar violence. The federal investigation also placed the murder within a wider legal framework. The question was no longer simply whether Kansas could prosecute Roeder for killing Tiller. Authorities also wanted to determine whether federal protections designed to safeguard access to reproductive health services had been violated. This distinction demonstrated how the case had expanded from a local homicide into an issue of national concern. Tiller's murder had occurred in Wichita, but the implications of the crime were much broader. The investigation also reinforced an important point about extremist violence. The perpetrator does not necessarily need to belong to a formal organization or receive direct orders from a larger group. The supplied facts identify Roeder's beliefs, his associations with anti-government and anti-abortion extremist networks, and his personal hostility toward Tiller. But the murder itself was carried out by Roeder. The responsibility for the decision remained his. This distinction would matter when considering the broader threat. Authorities had to recognize that violence could emerge from individuals acting on their own interpretation of an ideology. The investigation, therefore, became a process of understanding not only what had happened, but what kind of danger the murder represented. The case involving Gregory Hertz would later provide another reason for concern. Approximately 3 weeks after Tiller's death, Hertz was accused of threatening an abortion clinic in Boulder, Colorado, and later pleaded guilty to the relevant charges. That subsequent incident did not prove that Roeder had directed or inspired it, and it should not be treated as evidence of a coordinated campaign. But it demonstrated why federal officials remained concerned about threats against reproductive health facilities following Tiller's murder. The investigation into Tiller's death thus operated on 2 levels. At the first level was the immediate criminal question: Scott Roeder had killed George Tiller, and the state of Kansas would determine his criminal responsibility. At the second level was the broader security question. What did an ideologically motivated murder of a prominent abortion provider mean for other people working in the same field? The answers would influence both the prosecution and the federal response. Eventually, the case would move from investigation to trial. Roeder would not deny that he had killed Tiller. Instead, the central conflict would shift toward the meaning of that act. He believed his opposition to abortion gave his actions a moral purpose. Prosecutors would argue that his deliberate decision to target and kill Tiller constituted first-degree murder. The jury would ultimately have to determine where the law stood in relation to Roeder's claimed justification. By the time that question reached the courtroom, the investigative picture was already clear in its essential outline. George Tiller had been deliberately targeted. Scott Roeder had been arrested after fleeing the scene. His anti-abortion beliefs provided the motive, and his own acknowledgement connected those beliefs directly to the killing. The federal government had also recognized that the murder could have implications far beyond one victim and one defendant. What remained was for the justice system to decide how those facts should be judged. The investigation had established the path from ideology to violence. The trial would now determine the legal consequences of that path. When Scott Philip Roeder finally faced the justice system for the murder of George Wayne Tiller, the central facts of the case were already clear. Tiller was dead. Roeder had been arrested after leaving the church. Roeder did not ultimately deny that he had killed the physician. The difficult question for the courtroom was therefore not simply who had fired the fatal shot. It was what kind of killing had taken place, what intention had existed behind it, and whether Roeder's deeply held opposition to abortion could somehow transform a deliberate act of violence into something legally defensible. The prosecution charged Roeder with first-degree murder. That charge placed particular importance on the issue of premeditation. The law had to distinguish between a killing committed in an uncontrolled moment and one carried out after a person had formed the intention to kill. According to the facts of the case, the prosecution argued that Roeder's actions were not spontaneous. His hostility toward Tiller had existed before May 31, 2009. He had developed a particular hatred toward the doctor because of Tiller's work providing abortion services, and he deliberately sought him out. The circumstances surrounding the murder supported that interpretation. Roeder had gone to the area of Reformation Lutheran Church carrying a firearm. Tiller was inside the church. Roeder approached him and shot him. He then left the scene. The sequence was brief, but the prosecution's argument centered on the decision that preceded those few moments. A first-degree murder conviction required the jury to consider whether Roeder had acted deliberately, rather than simply losing control in an unexpected confrontation. The ideological motive became relevant because it demonstrated that the killing had not emerged from an unexplained or accidental encounter. Roeder had a reason for targeting Tiller, and that reason had developed before the day of the murder. The courtroom therefore became the place where an ideological belief would be separated from the legal question of criminal responsibility. Roeder's own position presented a disturbing complication. He acknowledged killing Tiller because of the abortion issue, but he attempted to frame the act as morally necessary. In his view, Tiller's work was so wrong that stopping him could be considered justified. That argument went beyond simply admitting that he had acted out of anger. Roeder was attempting to give the killing a moral meaning that, in his mind, elevated it above ordinary criminal conduct. For the prosecution, however, that reasoning did not provide a defense to murder. A person's conviction that another individual is committing a profound moral wrong does not create a private right to execute that person. The legal system does not allow individuals to become their own judges and enforcers. That principle was particularly important in a case where the defendant's ideology was directly connected to the victim's profession. If Roeder's argument were accepted, the boundaries of lawful political and moral disagreement would be dangerously weakened. Anyone could potentially claim that violence was justified because the target represented an evil. they personally believed had to be eliminated. The prosecution instead presented the case as a straightforward exercise of individual responsibility. Whatever Roeder believed about abortion, George Tiller remained a human being protected by law. Roeder's disagreement with Tiller's medical work did not give him the right to kill him. The distinction between motive and justification became central. Roeder's beliefs could explain why he committed the crime, but they did not excuse it. Indeed, the ideological motive could strengthen the prosecution's argument by showing that the killing was directed toward a specific target for a specific reason. The facts provided to the case indicate that prosecutors presented evidence showing that Roeder had formed his hostility toward Tiller beforehand and had deliberately sought an opportunity to act. That evidence was important because it addressed the question of premeditation. First-degree murder was not simply about whether a death had occurred. It required the jury to evaluate the nature of the defendant's intention. If Roeder had acted with a deliberate plan to kill Tiller, then the crime belonged in the most serious category of homicide charged against him. The prosecution's position was that this was exactly what had happened. Roeder's later acknowledgement of the killing did not undermine that conclusion. Instead, it helped clarify the motive. He had not accidentally caused Tiller's death and then invented an explanation afterward. He had targeted the physician because of abortion. His ideological hostility had preceded the killing, and his conduct on May 31st was the final expression of that hostility. The defense's attempt to portray the act as morally necessary, therefore, faced a fundamental obstacle. The law evaluates conduct according to legal standards, not according to the private moral system constructed by the defendant. A belief may be sincere and still be profoundly wrong. A person may believe an act is necessary and still be legally responsible for committing it. In Roeder's case, the jury had to decide whether the facts demonstrated first-degree murder despite his claimed moral justification. The answer was yes. Roeder was found guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict established that the jury rejected the idea that his anti-abortion beliefs could excuse or transform the killing. His ideology explained the motive, but it did not alter the legal character of the act. The sentence that followed was severe and permanent. Roeder received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The punishment meant that he would spend the remainder of his life within the Kansas prison system. The sentence also represented the final legal rejection of the idea that Roeder could personally determine that Tiller deserved to die. The courtroom had drawn a clear boundary between belief and violence. Roeder could oppose abortion. He could believe that Tiller's work was profoundly wrong, but he could not use those beliefs as a license to kill. The conviction also carried a wider significance because of the nature of the motive. Tiller had been targeted not because of a personal dispute unrelated to his profession, but because of what he represented to Roeder. The case therefore became an example of the danger posed by ideological violence directed at individuals. When a person is transformed in an extremist worldview into a symbol of everything the attacker opposes, the distinction between attacking an idea and attacking a human being can disappear. Tiller's death demonstrated the consequences of that disappearance. The legal proceedings did not erase the controversy surrounding abortion, nor were they intended to resolve the political and moral arguments that had existed for decades. The trial was narrower and more fundamental. It addressed one question of individual responsibility: whether Scott Roeder had committed first-degree murder when he deliberately killed George Tiller. The jury's verdict answered that question. The case also reinforced a principle that extends beyond the abortion debate. Political and religious conflicts can be intense. Moral disagreements can be profound. But the existence of disagreement does not suspend the rule of law. The legal system provides mechanisms through which people can challenge laws, policies, medical practices, and political decisions. Violence is not one of those mechanisms. Roeder's actions represented the rejection of that boundary. He replaced lawful disagreement with personal punishment. In doing so, he destroyed another person's life and permanently altered his own. The sentence ensured that his attempt to impose his ideology through violence would not become a precedent for private retaliation. Yet the courtroom could only determine Roeder's responsibility. It could not undo what had happened inside the church. George Tiller remained dead. His previous experience of surviving violence in 1993 had not protected him from a second attack. 16 years later, his professional life had made him controversial. But the law did not treat controversy as a justification for murder. The conviction therefore returned the case to its most basic truth. A physician had been killed because another man believed his work was morally intolerable. The defendant's belief was real, but its sincerity did not make it legitimate. The verdict established that the law would judge the act by what Roeder had done, not by the moral story he had constructed around it. First-degree murder resulted in a sentence of life without parole, closing the criminal case with a punishment that would last for the remainder of Roeder's life. But the larger consequences of Tiller's murder could not be contained within that sentence. Federal authorities had already recognized the possibility that the killing could affect the safety of other reproductive health providers and facilities. The concern would remain after the verdict because the ideology that had motivated Roeder did not disappear when he was imprisoned. Other threats could still emerge from individuals acting on similar extremist beliefs. That concern would become part of the aftermath of the case. The trial had answered the legal question, but it had not ended the wider story. The death of George Tiller had exposed how an ideological conflict could move from public confrontation to targeted violence. And the conviction of Scott Roeder could punish one perpetrator without eliminating the conditions that made such violence possible. The final chapter, therefore, would have to look beyond the courtroom and examine what remained after the verdict. The continuing concerns about threats, the federal response, and the enduring lesson of a murder committed because one person believed his convictions gave him the right to take another person's life. The conviction of Scott Philip Roeder brought the criminal case to its legal conclusion, but it did not bring an end to the concerns surrounding the murder of George Wayne Tiller. A courtroom could determine the responsibility of one man and impose a sentence, but it could not erase the circumstances that had allowed ideological hostility to become violence. Roeder had been sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole after being convicted of first-degree murder. Yet the questions raised by Tiller's death extended beyond the fate of the man who had killed him. They concerned the safety of other reproductive health providers, the consequences of extremist beliefs, and the dangerous point at which opposition to an idea becomes a justification for attacking a person. Tiller's death was particularly disturbing because of where it occurred. On May 31, 2009, he had gone to Reformation Lutheran Church in Wichita, Kansas. He had already lived for years under the pressure of intense opposition because of his medical work. He had survived a shooting in 1993. His clinic had been the focus of protests and confrontations. But on the morning of his death, he was not at that clinic. He was inside a church. That detail remained central to the meaning of the case. A place associated with worship and community had become the setting for an ideologically motivated murder. The location emphasized the extent to which the hostility surrounding Tiller's professional life had followed him beyond the workplace. His death demonstrated that a person can become a target not only because of what he personally does, but because of what an extremist believes that person represents. To Scott Roeder, Tiller was not simply a physician. He represented abortion, a practice Roeder considered morally intolerable. That perception helped transform Tiller from an individual into a symbol in Roeder's mind. Once that transformation occurred, the actual person could become secondary to the ideology attached to him. The result was fatal. Tiller was killed, not because Roeder had the legal authority to punish him, but because Roeder had convinced himself that his own beliefs justified an act the law recognized as murder. The aftermath also brought renewed attention from federal authorities. Only days after the killing, on June 5, 2009, the United States Department of Justice announced that its Civil Rights Division and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Kansas had opened a federal investigation. Authorities examined whether the murder violated federal laws, including the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, or FACE Act, and other federal statutes. The federal response reflected a concern that the murder could not be understood entirely as an isolated event. Tiller was a reproductive health provider, and his death had occurred in the context of an environment where abortion providers and facilities had already faced intense opposition. The government, therefore, had to consider the possibility of further threats and violence. The concern was not theoretical. Approximately 3 weeks after Tiller's murder, another case emerged involving Gregory Hertz, who was accused of threatening an abortion clinic in Boulder, Colorado. Hertz later pleaded guilty to the relevant threat charges. The existence of that subsequent case did not establish a coordinated campaign, nor did it demonstrate that Roeder had directed anyone else. But it illustrated why authorities had reason to remain alert after Tiller's death. Violence or threats motivated by extremist beliefs could involve individuals acting independently, without requiring a formal organization to direct them. That was one of the most important lessons contained in the broader story. The danger of extremism does not always depend upon a centralized command structure. An individual can absorb an ideology, develop a personal interpretation of that ideology, and eventually decide that violence is justified. In Roeder's case, the responsibility for the murder remained his. His beliefs helped explain his motive, but they did not compel him to kill. The decision to carry a firearm to the church, target Tiller, shoot him, and leave the scene was his own. That distinction matters because it prevents the story from becoming an excuse for blaming every person who shared a particular political or religious belief. The crime belonged to the individual who committed it. At the same time, the ideological motivation could not simply be ignored. Understanding why Roeder acted was essential to understanding the nature of the threat. He did not kill Tiller for money or because of an ordinary personal dispute. He killed him because of what Tiller represented in his own extremist worldview. That made the case fundamentally different from a conventional homicide motivated by a private conflict. The murder emerged from an attempt to impose a personal moral judgment through lethal force. The legal system ultimately rejected that attempt. Roeder's conviction for first-degree murder established that his belief in the necessity of the killing did not provide a legitimate defense. The sentence of life imprisonment without parole reinforced the same principle. No matter how strongly Roeder believed in his cause, the law did not recognize his personal conviction as authority to decide that Tiller should die. That principle extends beyond the particular controversy that surrounded the case. Democratic societies are built on the idea that people will disagree. Some disagreements involve questions that are deeply moral and emotionally charged. Abortion is one such issue. People may hold completely opposing convictions about it, and those convictions may be connected to religion, personal experience, politics, or deeply held ideas about human life. But disagreement does not eliminate the humanity of the person on the other side. It does not turn an opponent into a legitimate target, and it does not grant an individual the power to replace lawful processes with personal violence. George Tiller's murder exposed what happens when that boundary is destroyed. The tragedy is therefore not simply that one physician died. It is that an argument about a profound social issue was transformed into a justification for killing an individual. The result was irreversible. Tiller could not return to his church, his medical practice, or his life. The conviction could not restore him to his family or community. The law could punish Roeder, but punishment could not reverse the act. That is one of the defining realities of homicide. The legal system can determine responsibility after the fact, but it cannot restore the person who was taken. Tiller's earlier survival of violence in 1993 makes his death even more striking. He had already experienced the danger associated with his work and had continued living within that reality. 16 years later, another attack proved fatal. His death showed that surviving one act of violence does not mean the underlying threat has disappeared. The aftermath also raised a difficult question about how society responds to individuals who regard violence as a moral obligation. Roeder's case illustrates the danger of a mindset in which the attacker does not perceive himself as committing an ordinary crime. Instead, he sees himself as preventing something he believes is evil. That perception can make traditional deterrence less effective because the individual may regard punishment as an acceptable price for what he considers a righteous act. Yet the legal system's response remains necessary. By convicting Roeder and imposing life imprisonment without parole, the court affirmed that ideological conviction does not create immunity from criminal responsibility. There is another lesson in the location of Tiller's death. The church did not protect him because the danger was not confined to a particular building or profession. Once an individual has decided that another person is an acceptable target, the places normally associated with safety may no longer appear safe. The fact that Tiller was killed in a church gave the crime an especially disturbing symbolism. But the deeper lesson was broader. Violence motivated by ideology can follow a person wherever the attacker chooses to find him. Ultimately, the story of George Tiller and Scott Roeder is not a story about the resolution of the abortion debate. The murder did not settle that debate, and the conviction did not erase the profound disagreements that continue to surround it. Instead, the case stands as a warning about the consequences of allowing disagreement to become dehumanization and allowing dehumanization to become violence. George Tiller was a physician whose professional work made him controversial. He was also a man who attended church on a Sunday morning. Scott Roeder was a man with intensely held beliefs who chose to act on them through violence. The law judged that choice as first-degree murder and sentenced him to spend the rest of his life in prison without parole. In the end, the most important fact is also the simplest. George Tiller did not die because a political argument was resolved against him. He died because another individual decided that an ideological conviction gave him the right to take a human life. It did not. The murder inside the church remains a stark example of the distance between believing another person is wrong and believing that person has forfeited the right to live. That distance is where the boundary between disagreement and violence exists. Once that boundary is crossed, there is no argument strong enough to restore what has been lost. The story of George Wayne Tiller and Scott Philip Roeder does not become easier to understand simply because the legal process eventually reached a conclusion. Roeder was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But a verdict cannot change the events that produced it. It cannot return a person to the church where he worshipped, restore a physician to the work he had spent his life performing, or remove the consequences that spread outward from a single act of violence. What a verdict can do is establish responsibility. In this case, the responsibility belonged to Scott Roeder. The evidence and circumstances surrounding the crime showed that George Tiller had been deliberately targeted because of his work providing abortion services. Roeder's own acknowledgement that he killed Tiller because of the abortion issue made the ideological motive central to the case. That motive is what separates this murder from an ordinary personal dispute. There was no suggestion in the supplied facts that Tiller and Roeder had been involved in a conventional conflict that suddenly became fatal. The killing grew from Roeder's deeply held opposition to abortion and his particular hostility toward Tiller. That distinction matters because it reveals the danger of transforming a person into a symbol. George Tiller was a physician, but to Roeder he represented something larger. The medical practice that Roeder considered morally unacceptable. Once Tiller was reduced to that symbol in Roeder's thinking, the actual human being could be pushed into the background. The consequences of that way of thinking were irreversible. Tiller had already experienced violence before his death. In 1993, he had been shot and survived. That earlier attack established that the hostility surrounding his professional work could become physical. Yet survival did not end the danger. 16 years later, On May 31, 2009, Tiller went to Reformation Lutheran Church in Wichita. He was not at his clinic. He was not participating in a demonstration. He was in a place associated with worship. Roeder arrived carrying a firearm and ultimately shot him inside the church. The contrast between the setting and the violence remains one of the most disturbing elements of the case. The murder demonstrated that the conflict surrounding Tiller's profession could follow him into a setting outside his medical work. It also showed why authorities had reason to be concerned about the safety of other reproductive health providers. When a person is attacked because of the service he provides, others performing the same work may become potential targets for individuals who share similar extremist beliefs. This concern was reflected in the federal response. On June 5, 2009, only days after Tiller's death, the United States Department of Justice announced that its Civil Rights Division and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Kansas had opened a federal investigation. Authorities examined whether the murder involved violations of federal laws, including the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, or FACE Act, and other federal statutes. The federal investigation demonstrated that the significance of Tiller's murder extended beyond the boundaries of a single Kansas homicide. The government had to consider the possibility that the attack represented a broader threat to reproductive health providers and facilities. The concern became particularly relevant when another case emerged approximately 3 weeks after Tiller's death. Gregory Hertz was accused of threatening an abortion clinic in Boulder, Colorado, and later pleaded guilty to the relevant threat charges. The Hertz case should not be confused with the Tiller murder or presented as evidence of a coordinated operation. The supplied facts do not establish such a connection. Instead, it illustrates the reason authorities remain concerned about threats after Tiller's death. Extremist violence can involve individuals acting independently, motivated by their own interpretation of an ideology. That was one of the most significant aspects of Roeder's case. The murder did not require a formal command structure to become deadly. Roeder had developed his own beliefs, his own hostility toward Tiller, and his own conviction that violence was necessary. The responsibility for his actions, therefore, remained his. His ideology explains the motive, but it does not transfer responsibility away from the person who made the decision. This distinction is essential when discussing extremist crimes. It is possible to examine the ideas that influenced an offender without blaming everyone who shares a broad political or religious position. The abortion debate itself was not responsible for Tiller's murder. A political disagreement did not pull the trigger. A belief system did not physically force Roeder to enter the church. The decision was made by an individual who chose to turn his opposition into violence. That is precisely why the legal response mattered. The court did not have to decide whether abortion was morally right or wrong. It had to decide whether Roeder had committed murder and whether that murder met the legal standard. For first-degree murder, the jury concluded that it did. Roeder's attempt to portray his actions as morally necessary did not change the legal reality. His conviction established that personal morality cannot replace the law when it comes to taking another person's life. This principle is broader than the particular circumstances of the Tiller case. Every society contains disputes that are difficult, emotional, and deeply personal. People can believe that an institution is unjust, that a policy is immoral, or that another person's actions are profoundly wrong. But those beliefs do not create a private system of justice in which an individual becomes judge, jury, and executioner. The moment someone adopts that role, lawful disagreement becomes violence. Tiller's death provides a stark example of where that path can lead. The murder also raises the question of what is lost when public controversy overwhelms the identity of the individual involved. George Tiller was widely known because of his medical work, and that work placed him at the center of a national controversy. But his death occurred in a setting that reminded the public that he had a life beyond the controversy. He went to church. He participated in a religious community. He was a person rather than simply a political symbol. Remembering that distinction is important because extremist violence often depends upon dehumanization. When an opponent becomes only a symbol of an idea, it becomes easier for the attacker to imagine that eliminating the person somehow eliminates the idea. But Tiller's murder did not resolve the abortion debate. It did not erase disagreement. It did not make one side's beliefs disappear. It only took a human life. That is one of the most tragic elements of the case. Violence promised Roeder a solution to a conflict that violence could never actually solve. His action ended Tiller's life, but it did not end the controversy surrounding abortion. Instead, it created another layer of suffering and concern, while also sending law enforcement into a broader effort to protect people and facilities that might face similar threats. The final outcome of the criminal case was therefore both clear and limited. Roeder was held responsible and sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the punishment could not repair the damage. It could not undo the murder inside Reformation Lutheran Church. It could not restore the ordinary Sunday morning that had been interrupted by violence. And it could not eliminate the possibility that another individual might someday make the same dangerous transformation from belief to violence. That is why the lasting significance of the Tiller case lies not simply in the identity of the victim or the ideology of the killer. It lies in the boundary the murder crossed. George Tiller was a controversial physician. Scott Roeder was a man with extreme opposition to abortion. Those facts explain the context, but they do not make the killing inevitable. Between belief and murder, there was a decision. Roeder made that decision. The law rejected his justification and recognized the act for what it was: first-degree murder. In the end, the story returns to the image with which it began. A Sunday morning, a church in Wichita, a physician who had already survived violence once before, a man carrying an extremist conviction into a place of worship, and then a gunshot that ended George Tiller's life. The most important lesson is not that disagreement is dangerous. Disagreement is a normal part of society. The danger begins when disagreement becomes hatred, when hatred becomes dehumanization, and when dehumanization becomes the belief that another person has forfeited the right to live. George Tiller's death stands as a reminder that no political, religious, or moral conviction grants an individual that authority. The murder ended one man's life, but it could not settle the issue that motivated it. What remained was the responsibility of the law, the grief created by the loss, and the continuing need to recognize the difference between opposing an idea and destroying the person who represents it. In that difference lies the boundary that Scott Roeder crossed, and in the consequences of that crossing lies the enduring significance of the case. The conviction of Scott Philip Roeder established a legal ending to the murder of George Wayne Tiller. But the end of a criminal proceeding is not necessarily the end of a story. A verdict can identify guilt. A sentence can determine punishment. A federal investigation can examine whether broader laws were violated. But none of those things can return a person whose life has been taken. In the case of George Tiller, the consequences of the murder extended beyond the courtroom because the circumstances surrounding his death raised questions that could not be answered by a single conviction. They concerned the danger faced by reproductive health providers, the role of extremist ideology in motivating individual acts of violence, and the boundary between deeply held belief and criminal action. Tiller's life had already been shaped by controversy long before May 31, 2009. As an obstetrician-gynecologist in Wichita, Kansas, he provided abortion services, including services involving later-stage pregnancies. That work placed him at the center of an extraordinarily divisive issue. His clinic became a focus of opposition, demonstrations, and confrontation. He was not an anonymous physician working outside public attention. His name was nationally recognized because of the nature of his medical practice, and the hostility directed toward him had already become serious enough that he was shot in 1993 and survived. That earlier attack was an unmistakable warning that opposition to his work could become physical. Yet Tiller continued with his life and his profession. On May 31, 2009, he went to Reformation Lutheran Church in Wichita. The setting was significant because it existed outside the immediate environment of his medical work. He was not at the clinic that morning. He was not standing in the middle of a public confrontation. He was attending church. Scott Roeder nevertheless came to the area carrying a firearm. He had developed a particular hatred toward Tiller because of the physician's work, and he ultimately shot him inside the church. Roeder then left the scene. The murder was therefore not simply the final moment in a long-running political controversy. It was the point at which one individual's ideological hostility became lethal. After the arrest, the investigation quickly established a direct connection between Roeder's beliefs and the killing. Roeder later acknowledged that he had killed Tiller because of the abortion issue. That admission was significant because it placed the motive in clear view. The investigation did not have to rely entirely on speculation about why Tiller had been targeted. Roeder himself connected the murder to his opposition to abortion. Yet, understanding a motive is not the same as accepting it as a justification. That distinction remained at the heart of the legal response. Roeder believed that Tiller's actions were so morally wrong that stopping him was necessary. But the law does not give individuals the authority to decide that someone else has forfeited the right to live. This was the fundamental principle that the criminal proceedings ultimately affirmed. Roeder was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. His personal convictions could explain why he acted, but they could not change the legal nature of what he had done. The conviction also demonstrated that the justice system would not recognize ideological certainty as a substitute for lawful authority. That principle becomes particularly important in cases involving extremism because extremist offenders may not view themselves as criminals in the ordinary sense. They may believe they are acting in defense of something they consider sacred or essential. They may regard punishment as a consequence worth accepting. But the existence of that belief does not make the violence legitimate. In Tiller's case, the jury rejected the idea that Roeder's moral opposition to abortion could excuse the killing. The murder remained first-degree murder regardless of the justification Roeder attempted to attach to it. The federal response to Tiller's death also demonstrated that authorities were looking beyond the immediate prosecution. On June 5, 2009, the Department of Justice announced that its Civil Rights Division and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Kansas had opened a federal investigation. Authorities examined whether the murder violated federal laws, including the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, or FACE Act, and other federal statutes. The federal inquiry reflected concern about the wider implications of the crime. Tiller was a reproductive health provider who had been targeted because of his professional work, and authorities had to consider the safety of other providers and facilities. The possibility of additional violence could not simply be dismissed after one suspect had been arrested. The subsequent case involving Gregory Hertz illustrated that concern. Approximately 3 weeks after Tiller's murder, Hertz was accused of threatening an abortion clinic in Boulder, Colorado. He later pleaded guilty to the relevant threat charges. The facts provided do not establish that Hertz was part of a coordinated operation with Roeder, nor do they demonstrate that Roeder directed the later threat. What the case does show is why authorities remain concerned about individuals who might act independently from extremist beliefs. A person does not necessarily need to belong to a formal organization to become dangerous. The Tiller case demonstrated that an individual can develop an extreme interpretation of an ideology and decide on his own that violence is justified. That possibility made the protection of reproductive health providers an important concern after the murder. It also made the case significant beyond Kansas. Tiller's death had occurred in a single church, but the underlying conflict existed across the country. The murder raised the possibility that other physicians and facilities could become targets simply because they were associated with the same controversial medical service. Federal authorities, therefore, had reason to consider the broader environment rather than treating the murder as an isolated personal tragedy. At the same time, the case should not be misunderstood as an indictment of everyone who opposed abortion. The existence of strong opposition to abortion does not itself constitute extremism or violence. People can hold deeply different moral convictions and still reject violence completely. The central issue in Roeder's case was not merely what he believed. It was what he chose to do because of what he believed. He moved from opposition to personal targeting and from personal targeting to murder. That progression is what made the case so disturbing. The lesson is not that strong convictions are inherently dangerous. The lesson is that convictions become dangerous when a person begins to believe that personal belief provides authority to harm another human being. Tiller's murder also reminds us of the importance of seeing victims as people rather than symbols. In the public debate surrounding abortion, Tiller's name had become associated with a position that provoked intense reactions. But he was more than a name in a political argument. He was a physician. He was a member of a church community. He was someone who had already survived an attack and continued living with the risks associated with his profession. On the morning of his death, he was simply attending church. The fact that he was killed there is one of the strongest reminders that public controversy does not erase private humanity. When an extremist reduces another person to a symbol, it becomes easier to imagine that eliminating the individual can somehow solve the conflict represented by that person. But Roeder did not eliminate the abortion debate by killing Tiller. He did not settle the moral questions surrounding the procedure. He did not make opposing beliefs disappear. He only ended the life of one physician and created another chapter of violence around an already painful national conflict. The sentence imposed on Roeder was therefore both a punishment and a declaration of legal boundaries. Life imprisonment without parole meant that he would spend the remainder of his life in prison. But even that sentence had limits. It could not undo the shooting. It could not restore Tiller to his church. It could not erase the fear created among others who worked in reproductive health. And it could not guarantee that another individual would never again attempt to turn ideology into violence. What the law could do was establish responsibility and affirm that no private belief system places a person above the law. In the end, that may be the clearest way to understand the lasting significance of the case. George Tiller was killed because Scott Roeder believed that Tiller's work was morally unacceptable. Roeder's belief was the explanation for the crime, but it was never a legitimate justification for it. The courtroom established that distinction. The federal investigation demonstrated that the consequences extended beyond one victim. And the concerns that followed the murder showed why ideological violence is never limited to the moment when the weapon is fired. The case began with a physician entering a church on a Sunday morning and ended legally with his killer receiving a sentence that would keep him in prison for life. Between those 2 points was a chain of decisions that could not be reversed. Tiller's death remains a reminder of what happens when an individual stops seeing an opponent as a human being and starts seeing him only as an obstacle to a cause. The argument that Roeder believed he was defending did not require a murder to survive. The killing changed nothing about the underlying disagreement. It only created a victim, a perpetrator, and a permanent consequence. That is perhaps the most important conclusion to draw from the case. No conviction can restore a life, and no ideology can justify taking one. The law can punish the person responsible, but the deeper responsibility of society is to preserve the boundary between conviction and violence before that boundary is crossed. In the story of George Tiller and Scott Roeder, that boundary was crossed inside a church on a Sunday morning. What remained afterward was the evidence of where such a decision leads. One man dead, another condemned to spend the rest of his life in prison, and a nation left to confront the dangers that arise when ideological hatred is allowed to become an excuse for murder. The story of George Wayne Tiller and Scott Philip Roeder ends with a verdict, a sentence, and a life that was permanently taken But the meaning of the case reaches beyond the final judgment. On May 31st, 2009, Tiller went to Reformation Lutheran Church in Wichita, Kansas. He was an obstetrician gynecologist whose professional work had made him one of the most controversial abortion providers in the United States. He had spent years at the center of an intense national conflict, and he had already experienced violence before his death. In 1993, he had survived a shooting. 16 years later, the danger that had followed him throughout his professional life reached him again, this time inside his church. Scott Philip Roeder came to the area carrying a firearm. He had developed strong anti-abortion beliefs and a particular hostility toward Tiller because of the physician's work. He shot Tiller inside the church and then left the scene. Those facts are straightforward. What makes the case difficult to forget is what they reveal about the transformation of an idea into an act of violence. Abortion was, and remains, a profoundly divisive issue. People hold opposing moral, religious, political, and personal convictions about it. George Tiller's work placed him directly within that conflict. His clinic had become a focus of protests and confrontation, and his name had become nationally recognized because of the services he provided. But none of those circumstances changed the basic principle that he remained a human being with a right to live. The tragedy of the case is that Scott Roeder stopped seeing him in those terms. In Roeder's worldview, Tiller had become more than a physician. He had become a representation of the practice Roeder considered morally intolerable. That transformation from person to symbol is an important part of understanding extremist violence. When an individual stops seeing an opponent as a human being and instead sees only the idea that opponent represents, the psychological barrier against violence can become easier to cross. The person becomes an obstacle. The cause becomes more important than the life standing in its way. In Roeder's case, that process ended with murder. Yet it is equally important not to confuse the existence of strong political or religious beliefs with violent extremism. The abortion debate contains millions of people who disagree passionately but reject violence. The issue in this case was not simply that Roeder opposed abortion. It was that he chose to turn his opposition into an act of lethal violence against another person. His own later acknowledgement that he killed Tiller because of the abortion issue made that connection clear. His beliefs explained his motive, but they did not justify his conduct. The justice system eventually made that distinction explicit. Roeder was prosecuted for first-degree murder. The central legal question involved the nature of his intent and whether the killing had been deliberate and planned. The facts presented in the case showed that his hostility toward Tiller existed before the murder, and that he deliberately sought him out. He did not simply encounter Tiller in an unexpected confrontation and react without thought. He came to the church carrying a firearm, targeted the physician, shot him, and left. The jury found Roeder guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentence meant that the man who had believed he was acting according to a moral purpose would spend the remainder of his life in prison. His personal interpretation of morality could not replace the law. That principle is fundamental to any society in which people are permitted to hold different beliefs. If personal conviction became a license to punish others physically, disagreement would cease to be a manageable part of public life and become a justification for private violence. The law exists in part to prevent that outcome. It does not require people to agree with one another. It requires them to recognize limits on what they may do to one another. The federal response to Tiller's murder reinforced the broader significance of those limits. On June 5, 2009, the Department of Justice announced that its Civil Rights Division and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Kansas had opened a federal investigation. Authorities examined whether the murder violated federal law, including the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act and other federal statutes. The federal involvement reflected concern about more than one victim. Tiller had been targeted because of his professional role. and authorities had reason to consider the safety of other reproductive health providers and facilities. The murder had therefore become part of a wider question. What happens when individuals who hold extremist beliefs decide that people associated with a controversial practice are legitimate targets? The subsequent case involving Gregory Hertz, who was accused of threatening an abortion clinic in Boulder, Colorado, approximately 3 weeks after Tiller's murder, and later pleaded guilty to the relevant charges, demonstrated why that concern could not simply be dismissed. The facts do not establish a coordinated relationship between Hertz and Roeder, nor do they suggest that every threat after Tiller's death was part of one organized campaign. Instead, the episode illustrates the broader danger of individuals acting independently from extremist beliefs. A formal organization is not always necessary for ideology to become dangerous. An individual can absorb an extreme worldview and then decide, entirely on his own, that violence is necessary. That was the danger represented by Roeder. His actions belonged to him, and the responsibility for them remained his. But the ideological nature of the crime meant that authorities had to consider the possibility of similar threats from others. Tiller's murder also demonstrates the limitations of punishment. Roeder's conviction brought accountability, but it could not restore the victim. No sentence could return Tiller to his church or his medical practice. No verdict could undo the consequences for the people who knew him. The justice system could determine who was responsible and impose a punishment, but it could not reverse the moment when a life was taken. That is why the human dimension of the case must remain central. George Tiller should not be remembered only as the target of a political controversy. He was a physician whose work placed him in a contentious field. He was also a person who had survived an earlier shooting and continued with his life. On the morning of his death, he went to church. The fact that he was killed there is perhaps the clearest reminder that the victim was a person, not merely a symbol. The setting also gives the case its most haunting contrast. A church is associated with worship, community, and a search for meaning. Yet inside that setting, Roeder acted on a belief that his own interpretation of morality gave him permission to kill. The result was not justice. It was death. The abortion debate did not end with Tiller's murder. The arguments did not disappear. The opposing convictions did not suddenly become reconciled. Roeder's violence solved none of the questions that had motivated him. It did not eliminate abortion. It did not settle the moral debate. It did not make Tiller's opponents correct or his supporters victorious. It simply destroyed one human life and placed another behind bars for the rest of his life. That fact reveals the futility of ideological violence. It can create irreversible damage, but it cannot resolve the underlying disagreement that produced it. The lasting lesson of the case is therefore not about which side of the abortion debate is right. It is about the boundary between conviction and violence. People may believe deeply. They may protest passionately. They may attempt to change laws, institutions, and medical practices. They may regard an opposing position as profoundly wrong. But there remains a line that cannot be crossed without destroying the foundations of lawful society. The decision to take another person's life because of what that person represents. Scott Roeder crossed that line. George Tiller paid the ultimate price. The legal system later recognized the act as first-degree murder and sentenced Roeder to life, without parole. But the most enduring judgment belongs to the facts themselves. Tiller's life cannot be restored, and the controversy that surrounded him cannot be erased. What can be remembered is the boundary that his death makes painfully visible. A belief can explain an action, but it does not automatically justify it. A cause can be passionately defended, but it does not grant permission to kill. And a person who believes that violence is necessary does not become an instrument of justice simply because he believes in the righteousness of his cause. On that Sunday morning in Wichita, George Tiller entered a church. Scott Roeder entered with a weapon. One man came to worship. The other came carrying an ideology he had allowed to become a justification for violence. By the end of the morning, Tiller was dead. Roeder's future had been changed forever. and the United States was confronting another example of how extremist conviction can become lethal. The story ends not with the idea that disagreement must disappear, but with the recognition that disagreement must remain human. The moment an opponent ceases to be seen as a person and becomes merely an enemy to be eliminated, the possibility of violence becomes real. George Tiller's murder stands as a stark reminder of where that path can lead. The courtroom delivered its verdict. Roeder received his sentence. But the deeper lesson remains outside the courtroom. No conviction is powerful enough to restore a stolen life. And no ideology is important enough to make murder a legitimate answer. George Tiller went to church on a Sunday morning. He did not leave alive. His killer believed his cause justified what he did. The law and the facts of the case said otherwise. And that difference, the difference between believing something passionately and having the right to act violently upon it, is where the story of George Tiller and Scott Roeder ultimately comes to an end.